The fluorescent light hummed a high, relentless note, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the small, stuffy courtroom. Outside, a pale winter sun fought a losing battle with the clouds, but here there was no window to see it. Just the polished wood of the judge's bench and the cold, unyielding surface of the tables where Miss Willie sat. The air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a scent that carried the weight of countless past disputes. She sat at a heavy table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, feeling the clammy chill of her own skin. Beside her, her brother Guy shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the scuffs on his worn leather shoes. He was a man-child of 40, with a guileless face and hands that seemed perpetually lost at the ends of his long arms. Every few minutes, he'd look up at her, a fleeting, hopeful flicker in his soft brown eyes, as if seeking permission to feel safe. She'd offer a tight, reassuring smile, her protective instincts a physical ache in her chest. Across the room, their brother Ralph sat with his wife. Ralph looked different, Ms. Willie thought, smaller somehow, without the usual puffed-out swagger of their family gatherings. He had a solid, confident look on the surface, but she could see the frantic energy of a cornered animal in the way his leg bounced under the table and the way his fingers drummed a silent, frantic rhythm. His wife sat stiffly beside him, a woman Ms. Willie had never known well, but whose pursed lips and careful avoidance of eye contact spoke volumes. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, read through the file again, the rustle of papers the only sound to break the oppressive silence. It was a silence filled with unspoken accusations, with the grief of a family broken. "This is a particularly sad family situation," the judge began, her voice calm and even. Her eyes lifted from the pages, settling first on Miss Willie. She looked from her to Guy. "You are Miss Willie?" Yes, Miss Willie replied, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet room. "And this is your brother?" the judge asked, her gaze shifting to Guy. "Correct." "And this is your brother's wife?" she asked, her attention turning to Ralph's table to you. "This is the sister-in-law." Ralph's wife gave a small, jerky nod. The judge returned her attention to Miss Willie. "According to your complaint," she said, "you will be speaking for your brother unless I need to speak for him." "Yes," Miss Willie confirmed, her voice gaining a little more strength. The judge's focus shifted finally to Guy. "How old are you?" Guy's head came up slowly, a furrow forming between his brows as he processed the question. 22, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was an old lie, one that he told out of habit, out of the ingrained need to simplify the world around him. He was well past 40. The judge seemed to understand. She didn't press him on the number. Instead, she asked, "Do you want to speak to me first? Want to try?" Guy looked to Ms. Willie, his eyes wide and uncertain. She gave him a small nod, a quiet cue that it was okay to try, that he was safe to speak. He looked back at the judge and nodded with a new firmness. Yes, yes. The judge acknowledged his answer with a simple look before moving on. "According to your complaint," she said, now addressing Guy directly, "you receive Social Security disability?" "Yes, I do," he said, his answer coming out a little faster this time. "That's because you have some sort of learning disability?" "Correct." The questions were simple, designed to be easy for him to answer. The judge's tone was careful, patient. She was building a foundation of facts, a step-by-step reconstruction of events, but the air was still heavy with an unstated tension. "And how much do you receive a month from Social Security?" Guy's brow furrowed again. He paused, his gaze going to the floor. The number was always shifting in his mind. "Right now, $850, he said, and then, as if to confirm it, $850. The judge made a note, her pen scratching against the paper. "According to your complaint," she continued, "there was a time when your brother was the payee for your Social Security?" "Correct." "For about a year?" Ms. Willie saw the question as a small trap, a way to test their facts. She leaned forward, but before she could speak, Guy answered. "Approximately 2 years, he said with a surprising clarity. 2 years, the judge repeated. "Yes, since 95. The judge's gaze flicked to Ralph, a silent acknowledgement of the discrepancy, a subtle signal that she was watching, that she had heard. The color in Ralph's face, which had been high and flushed, seemed to thin, as if the blood had drained away. He sat up a little straighter in his chair, trying to reclaim his confident posture. And you say that while he was the payee for your Social Security, he didn't pay certain of your bills? Correct, Guy said. The question shifted now, becoming more specific, probing the heart of the matter. Now, was your brother living with you for a period of time? Is that what I understand? Yes, he was, Guy confirmed. And you say that you spent more than you received? Yes, I did. Ralph's leg had stopped bouncing. He sat perfectly still, his wife's hand now resting on his forearm. The judge was no longer just building a timeline. She was digging for details, for accountability. It was the moment Ms. Willie had been waiting for, the moment Ralph's thin confidence would finally be tested. He had been so sure of himself in their preliminary meetings, dismissing her concerns, certain that the family name and his own smooth words would be enough to deflect any real scrutiny. But the judge's relentless, quiet questioning was a force he had not anticipated. The judge flipped a page in the file. She looked up, her gaze settling directly on Ralph. Let's start with the utility bills, she said. Please itemize for me how the money was spent. Well, tell me about that, the judge said, her voice now directed at Ralph. Her eyes, magnified by her glasses, were calm and unblinking, twin pools of scrutiny. The question hung in the air, a simple request that seemed to demand an entire confession. Ralph's mouth opened and closed once before he found his words. He seemed to be trying to conjure a confident, businesslike tone. Well, there's a few things, he began, gesturing with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. For one, the living expenses alone. His rent incurred almost ate his monthly installments. The judge held up a silent command for him to stop. Just a second, let's try to keep it simple. Her gaze drifted to the file on her desk as she reoriented her questions. You got all of his Social Security, $850. For how long a period did you get the $850 a month? Ralph's shoulders tightened. He was used to being in control of a conversation, to spinning the facts to his advantage. The judge's methodical approach was throwing him off balance. It wasn't $850, he corrected, a hint of his old arrogance returning. He started at $730. It escalates every year. The judge simply nodded, a patient confirmation. Okay, so it started. For how long did you get his Social Security? For 2 years, Ralph said. He looked at Ms. Willie as he said it, a glance filled with a quiet challenge, as if to say, see, we're on the same page. About 2 years, almost 2 years. And was he living with you during that 2-year period or not? Yes, he was. And what did you use that money for? To pay his living expenses, Ralph said, as if this should be obvious. Like what? Ralph hesitated, the practiced ease beginning to fray around the edges. We're living in a hotel. I was paying his hotel expenses week to week. Ms. Willie closed her eyes for a brief moment, the words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The memory of that place was like a bad dream. She had helped him move out of a small, cramped apartment when Ralph had insisted on moving Guy in with him. Guy had a small bedroom, Ralph and his wife had the other, but Ralph had lost his job not long after, and the apartment had fallen through. Instead of moving in with Miss Willie, who had space for him, Ralph had insisted they would be fine. The fine had been living at the Budget Inn on the highway. It was a place that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. The carpets were a faded, stained brown, and the thin walls seemed to hold the echoes of every argument, every laugh, every moment of desperation that had ever taken place within them. She remembered visiting Guy and seeing the sadness in his eyes. He had his own room, a single bed, a small television, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. Ralph and his wife were in the room next door. She had seen him on the floor, counting out the crumpled bills and jingling the loose change in his hand to pay the hotel manager on Friday nights. His hands, so gentle when he had held her hand in the car, were rough and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor. Yet they handled the small, worn bills with a peculiar, meticulous care. It was the only part of his life he could control. The judge's voice brought her back to the present. Were you all living in the same room? No, Ralph said quickly. He had his room. He had his own room, and we had. Ralph's sentence trailed off, his confidence now completely gone. Okay, so you were living in a hotel for a while? The judge prodded. Yeah. Okay, and what was his hotel bill when you were living there? It was $175 a week. $175 a week. Ms. Willie did the math in her head. A month had 4 weeks, so 175 times 4 was 700. Guy was getting $730 at the time. Ralph was taking all but $30, money that was supposed to cover everything else. Clothes, food, entertainment, all the things that made a life worth living. It was a suffocating truth, and it made her feel sick. "And how long did you stay in the hotel?" the judge asked. "Probably about 8 months, 6 months," Ralph said, his voice a low mumble. He had lost track of the timeline, or maybe he was trying to lose it. Miss Willie couldn't hold back. Her voice, usually so cautious, came out with a sharp edge. "It was a year," she said. Guy, who had been sitting quietly, looked up, a rare flash of clarity in his eyes. "It was almost a year," he confirmed, his voice a quiet echo. The judge looked from one of them to the other, making another note. "Let me ask you this question, because this is going to be very difficult," she said, her voice dropping to a softer, more intimate tone as she addressed Ms. Willie. The empathy in her voice was a knife twist in the gut. It made her feel like this whole thing was her fault for not having a spare room for her brother. "I'm not going over a 2-year period to see whether you paid more or less. It's very hard to support somebody fully. You understand that, Ms. Willie, on $730 a month." Ms. Willie nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The judge was right. It was a pittance. How could anyone live on so little? It was the very reason she had tried to take over the payee status in the first place, because she saw the strain, the impossibility of it. "Okay," she whispered. "Right?" the judge pressed. "Yeah, right. I mean, we're not talking about a lot of money here," the judge said, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "Do you understand that?" "Yes." Ms. Willie's voice was barely a whisper. She looked at Guy, who was staring at his shoes again. It was a shared moment of pain, a quiet understanding of the smallness of their world and the impossible math of his life. "Okay," the judge said, and the air shifted again. The moment of shared sadness was over. Her voice returned to its crisp, professional tone, the empathy gone. "Let me go through some of these bills with you, sir. There's a $937 phone bill. Do you know anything about that?" Ralph flinched as if a wasp had stung him. A flush of deep crimson spread from his collar to his hairline. "A phone bill?" Ms. Willie's stomach clenched. She had no idea about a phone bill. She had been so focused on the living expenses and the daily struggle that she had never thought to ask about phone records. The judge held up a sheaf of papers, the phone company's logo clearly visible at the top. The document had been submitted by Ms. Willie's lawyer, but she had never seen it before. The pages were covered in a long list of numbers, dates, and times. The numbers, all 7-digit, were long-distance calls to Las Vegas. The calls were dozens of minutes long and often happened in the middle of the night. Her parents lived in Las Vegas. She had not spoken to them in months. Ralph had told her they were fine, that everything was okay. He had lied. The judge's gaze was now fixed on Ralph's face. He was staring at the bill, his eyes wide with a panicked horror. It was just for calls," he stammered, his confident exterior now completely cracked and crumbling. To, to Mom and Dad. Almost $1,000 in calls?" The judge's voice was as sharp as a scalpel. Over what period?" I, uh, I don't know," Ralph stammered. "A few months, I guess." "According to this," the judge said, her finger tracing a line on the document, "it's over a 10-month period, an average of almost $100 a month. That's a significant portion of his income." She looked at Guy, who was completely unaware of the bombshell that had just been dropped. He was just a mom, sitting in a courtroom hoping to get his life back. "Tell me, sir," the judge said, now looking at Ralph, her voice quiet but piercing. "Who precisely approved the phone in Guy's room? And why did no one track the mounting charges?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a deafening sound in the quiet room. The air was thick with the suffocating weight of Ralph's silence, a silence that felt heavier than any spoken lie. "Not really," Ralph said, his voice now a mere shadow of its former bluster. He looked at his wife, a silent plea for her to take over. Her name was Bonnie, and she leaned forward, her arms braced on the edge of the table. I think she probably can answer that, Ralph muttered, a pathetic attempt to pass the burden. Bonnie nodded once, a sharp, quick motion. Go ahead. She turned her gaze to the judge, her eyes filled with a hard, defensive light. Mainly, most of the bills was for him calling my mom and my dad. They live in Vegas. She paused, her voice taking on a righteous edge. And if you look at the bill, there's a lot of Vegas calls, because at that time, none of the other family members were dealing with Guy. So the only family he clung to was my family. Ms. Willie felt a cold wave of shame wash over her. It was a bitter, stinging shame, not just for Ralph's actions, but for the truth in his wife's words. The family had pulled away. She had too. When her lupus had flared up, her body attacking itself with an unrelenting, invisible fury, the doctors had told her she needed to focus on her own health. A serious kidney infection had followed, and the constant rounds of tests and appointments, the bone-deep weariness, had made it impossible to care for anyone else. Taking a step back had been a necessity, a way to survive, but it had left a vacuum that Ralph had filled. And now, seeing the result, the guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. Just a minute, the judge said, holding up a hand. Whose phone was this? Bonnie did not hesitate. This was his phone in his own room. She looked at Guy, her voice a little too loud, a little too proud. He looked back at her with the blank politeness of a child. He picked up the phone and he called my mom. The judge looked at Guy. So you had a phone in your room? He nodded slowly. His own room. You had a phone in your room? The judge repeated, a gentle prodding that was not a question so much as a confirmation. Yes, Guy said, his voice sincere and simple. The memory of the phone was a faint thing to him, a plastic object in a lonely room, a connection to a voice that had once been a comfort. The judge's gaze returned to the phone bill. And over what period of time did these $937 bill build up? They build up practically sometimes that she used to have me call her mom for her, Guy said, his memory wandering in a way that often happened. He was trying to be helpful, trying to answer what he thought was the question, but the words came out tangled and confused. Bonnie jumped in again, her voice cutting over his. Over how many months, do you know? About almost a year, she answered herself, a rush of exasperated confidence. Okay, the judge said. There was no judgment in her voice, only the dry tone of a person trying to make sense of a chaotic, ill-kept record. A man in the gallery, a stout, balding man in a worn jacket, cleared his throat. It was Dennis, the friend Bonnie had mentioned. He sat with his hands clasped, a patient, long-suffering look on his face. What about the medicine? The judge asked, her gaze sweeping over the whole group, as if asking the room at large. Ralph leaned forward. His medicine was being paid. I have the receipt. The insurance was taking care of his medicine, Bonnie added, her voice a little too quick. And we have witnesses here, she said, gesturing to Dennis. The conversation had become a frantic exchange, with each of them trying to get their version of events out. Ralph was defensive, Bonnie was desperate for validation, and Ms. Willie was watching with a sickening mix of dread and anger. The care of a human life, the small, mundane, and sacred details of it, had been reduced to a flurry of conflicting statements and half-remembered facts. Bonnie continued, her voice gaining speed. UCLA stopped taking care of it when he started being irresponsible as far as making his appointments. They took offense to that, and they didn't think he was that serious about that. We had the insurance payment damage. Because we used to let him drive our car to the hospital, Ralph interjected, seizing on a detail to show his magnanimity. Guy sat quietly, listening to the words as if they were about a stranger. But in his mind, the memories were not about missed appointments or irresponsible actions. They were impressions, sensory details that his brain had collected. The feeling of the seatbelt clicking across his chest, the low rumble of the car engine as Ralph drove him down the highway. The smell of the waiting room at the hospital, a strange mix of rubbing alcohol and old coffee, and the sight of countless people with downcast eyes and pale faces. The sound of his own name being called. He remembered being alone in the waiting room, the weight of the moment an anchor in his chest. He would sit there for hours, the air-conditioned cold seeping into his bones, and the only thing that felt real was the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Some of his visits at first started out, Ralph's voice was saying. Guy was going himself because none of the family members would come pick him up and take him to the hospital. He had said the words with a bitter edge, a clear jab at Ms. Willie. She flinched but said nothing. Bonnie's friend Dennis, sitting in the back, nodded his agreement. And our best friend right here, Dennis, when he was staying at the Dairy Inn, would come pick him up, take him to the hospital. The memory came flooding back to Guy, a clear, sharp picture. The sight of Dennis's beat-up sedan pulling into the hotel parking lot, the friendly, tired smile on his face. He remembered the feeling of gratitude, the quiet relief of being taken care of, even by a stranger. I would pick him up when his appointment was done, Ralph continued, his voice now a low, self-congratulatory drone. We would go to the pharmacy together. We would get his prescription, and we would come home. I have the receipts here. The medicine. The pharmacy was another set of memories. The way the pill bottles made a low plastic rustle when they were put in a bag. The smell of the place, a clean chemical scent that was almost sterile. The feeling of the cold counter under his palms as he stood waiting. He remembered the different colored pills, the smooth, chalky texture of the large white ones, the bitter taste of the small yellow ones. He remembered Ralph taking the bag and telling him he would keep them safe. The judge looked down at the receipt Ralph had given her, a small, faded piece of paper. She looked up again, her gaze passing over Ralph and Bonnie, over Dennis, and then back to Guy. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she was putting the pieces of the puzzle together. The receipts were a fact, but a piecemeal one. They proved a transaction, but they did not prove care. "Thank you," she said to Ralph, her voice now flat and devoid of any emotion. She set the receipt down and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Ralph. "I'd like to understand something else now." Her gaze shifted from Ralph to his wife and back again, a silent, penetrating force. "Tell me about the work arrangements. Your store, Mr. Ralph. How often did he work there, and was he truly paid?" "Okay, now stop for 1 second." The judge's voice was as calm and clear as a winter pond. She looked past Ralph, her gaze settling on Mrs. Willie, whose hands were still clasped so tightly they ached. "Ms. Willie, where were you when this was all going on?" Ms. Willie flinched. The question was not unexpected, but it felt like a direct accusation. The room, which had just been filled with the frantic energy of a defense, was now quiet, all eyes on her. She had not yet spoken about her own life, about the quiet agony that had pushed her to the sidelines. She looked at Guy, who seemed to shrink in his chair. "No, Guy," she whispered, a plea for him to stay silent. Ralph, seizing the moment, tried to speak for her. "Ralph and I were not getting along." "Shush, shush, shh." The judge held up a finger, a clear dismissal of his attempt to interject. She was not interested in his version of the story. She wanted to hear from the only other person who had tried to help Guy. Ms. Willie took a deep, shaky breath. "Ralph and I were not getting along. The family got along real bad, okay? Me and Ralph just wasn't even on speaking terms." She felt the familiar sting of resentment and grief, the years of family dysfunction boiling up to the surface. "Guy was with my sister, Selma, at first." She remembered her sister's kind, patient face, the way Selma had tried to talk sense into Guy. Selma told him, 'cause he wanted Ralph to be his payee, 'cause he loved her, all that stuff. And so my sister asked him, 'Are you sure you want to go with Ralph? Are you sure you want to do that?' So all the family members asked Guy, 'Are you sure you want to go with Ralph?' The narrative of their family's slow unraveling spilled out of her. So when I told Guy, 'My hands are tied, I'm through, you want to deal with him and her? I don't want to be bothered.' The words felt like an admission of failure. She had given up, had walked away, and now she was paying for it. So I stepped out of it, 'cause I got a bad health myself, so I didn't want to be bothered in all that mess." The judge's expression did not change. "I just want to know where you were at all this time?" she asked, her voice an unwavering probe. Miss Willie's voice cracked. She had never spoken of it to anyone outside her family. It was a private shame, a burden she carried alone. "I have lupus and kidney failure, okay? I didn't need the stress and everything. The judge, for the first time, looked at her with something like empathy, but it was quickly gone. So that you can't have your brother live with you? No, Ms. Willie said, the word coming out with a pained finality. It was the answer she had carried for so long, the truth of her impossible choice. He wanted to live with Ralph. Shh, the judge said again, this time to someone in the gallery. He wanted to live with Ralph. He wanted to live with Ralph, Mrs. Willie repeated, as if the words themselves held a key to understanding. Yes, a voice from the gallery confirmed. It was Guy's aunt, her other sister, Diane. The judge turned to Guy. You can answer. Guy, who had been listening with his usual quiet detachment, looked up. He seemed to be shaking off a memory, a bad dream he had just woken from. He looked at his aunt, at the judge, at his sister. His voice was a soft, lost thing. Yes? The judge waited. Tell me why you left Ralph. Guy's eyes went to Ralph, a direct, unfiltered look that seemed to hold a world of hurt. Okay, the reason why I left Ralph because, really, I was in the store, he began, and the memory of that day came flooding back to him with a clarity that was both painful and sharp. The air in the back of Ralph's sporting goods store was thick with the scent of cardboard and something dusty and metallic. The shelves were crammed with boxes of cleats, hockey sticks, and boxed weights that smelled like cold iron. Guy had spent his days there, answering the phone when it rang with its shrill, insistent noise, and tidying up the stock, straightening the shirts, and stacking the helmets in perfect, geometric columns. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a different tune than the ones in the courtroom, a low, consistent drone that lulled him into a simple rhythm of work and thought. He was so grateful to have a purpose, a place to go. It felt good to be useful, to be needed, to be out of the cramped hotel room. At the end of the day, Ralph would hand him a $10 bill. $10. It was a pitiful amount, but to Guy, it felt like a fortune. It was his own money, earned with the work of his own hands. He'd take it and put it in his pocket, a small weight that felt like a secret. Sometimes when the store was quiet, he'd sit on a stool in the back room and just run his fingers over the money, feeling the crispness of the paper. A quiet sense of pride. He knew Ralph wasn't paying him much, but he was family. Family took care of you. One day, Bonnie had come into the back room, her face flushed and angry from an argument she had just had with Ralph. Guy had been wiping down a shelf, a quiet, simple task. She had looked at him, her eyes sharp and full of a cold fury. You know where all your money's going? Your whole check? She had said, her voice a low, furious whisper. On UPS orders in this store. The words had hit him like a physical blow. He had stood frozen, the rag in his hand still, the truth of her accusations sinking in with a sickening finality. He had not understood what she meant, not exactly, but he knew it was bad. The idea of his money, his sacred, protected money, being used for some other purpose, for some business expense he knew nothing about, was a violation. Back in the courtroom, he finished his story. Bonnie had got mad at Ralph and turned around and told me, you know where all your money's going? Your whole check on UPS orders in this store. Ralph's face was a mask of furious denial. Did I say that, Guy? He said, his voice a low growl. Guy looked at him, his face a quiet tableau of hurt and betrayal. Shove it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was a phrase he had heard 100 times from Ralph. I don't want to hear you. He turned his attention back to the judge, a new confidence in his eyes. He had found his voice and he would not be silenced again. He's talking, he said, and the courtroom fell silent, waiting for him to continue. The judge simply nodded, a silent command for him to do just that. Guy took a deep breath. After that, I knew something was wrong. I called Ms. Willie to help me. I wanted to leave. He felt the judge's calm, steady gaze, and it gave him strength. The judge turned her attention to Ralph again. The law is very clear on this, Mr. Ralph. Minimum wage in this state is X dollars an hour. She rattled off the number with a casual precision. And whether it was a few hours a week or a full-time job, there is a legal obligation to pay for labor. Her voice was a low, even hum of reason, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the past half hour. There is a difference between a family member helping out and an employee, and if you are taking his money as a payee, And claiming to be paying him, that is a different matter altogether. Ralph sat in a stunned, resentful silence. He had been so sure of his own rightness. He had taken care of Guy. He had given him a room. He had given him a home, you saw. But the judge was not interested in his version of what was right. She was interested in what was legal. She wanted to know about minimum wage, about the value of work, about the line between generosity and exploitation. She picked up a yellow legal pad, her pen poised. I am going to need to see proof of payment, she said, her voice a quiet, inexorable force. Checks, stubs, ledgers. She looked from him to Bonnie. I'm sure you have a system for keeping track of all the cash that was moving through your household. I want to see it. And I was so hurt when she said that, Guy was saying, his voice thick with a remembered pain. He looked at Muswell, Willie, a silent plea for her to understand, because Ralph had left the store. Like it's the truth, you know. That's how I know Ralph was taking advantage of me. He shook his head, the betrayal still fresh. She come to me telling me, your brother's taking your money. He's doing this with his check. He's paying for UPS orders. This is what she said about him. He paused, a sigh rattling in his chest. You know, I be trying not to believe it, 'cause he come to me telling me, I'm not taking your money, Guy. Don't listen to that, to her, you know? But I can't help but, 'cause she keep putting it in my head, you know? Ralph is. The judge watched him, her face a careful blank. So you got angry. So I got angry and we was in the store, so I decided that I didn't want to work in the store no more. The statement hung in the air, a simple act of rebellion that had set the whole thing in motion. So you were working in your brother's store? The judge confirmed, her gaze flicking to Ralph. Yeah, for only really $10 a day. The paltry sum, when spoken aloud in the sterile courtroom, sounded even more pathetic. And I told him I decided because he had me sleeping in the store a couple nights, and The judge cut him off, her focus turning to Ralph. What kind of store do you have, sir? Ralph's shoulders slumped. The pretense of a simple, helpful arrangement had been stripped away. Sporting goods store. A heavy sigh escaped Guy, a soft, defeated sound. The judge looked at him. And your brother was working in your store? Yeah, I guess you could call it that, Ralph said, the words a thin, defensive shield. The judge's gaze sharpened. What do you mean you guess you could call it that? He said he was working there every day. He was there. Doing what? The judge's voice was a low, insistent demand. Guy sighed again, the quiet sound of a man who had lost too much to a family that had taken too much. Taking care of the stock? The judge prodded. Ralph mumbled something, a noise of dissent. No, he wasn't taking care of the stock. Cleaning up? Answer the phones, Bonnie said, interjecting from beside Ralph. Answer the phone, Ralph confirmed. Just a minute. Answer the phone, the judge said, the disbelief clear in her voice. Yeah. And he was there every day? Ralph shook his head. He wasn't there every day. He was late a lot of times. Yeah, you know, he was a big help to me, and I'm not denying that. The words felt hollow, an empty gesture of kindness that was too little, too late. Good, the judge said, her voice dry. How much did you pay him? Ralph's shoulders hunched. It varied, as we made money. He was flailing, trying to find a footing on the shifting sands of his own half-truths. How much did, the judge began, but he cut her off. He made money, it depended. There was no, I said, hourly salary. Why not? The question was a single, devastating blow. He's your brother. That doesn't mean he's a slave. That means if he's working in your store, he gets an hourly wage. He gets minimum wage. He gets whatever the minimum wage was when he was working there in '96. He should have been paid. Ralph looked stunned, as if he had never considered this simple truth. If he's not in your store, he could be working someplace else. Well, that's the thing, Ralph said, a new self-pitying note in his voice. He couldn't work anywhere else because of his inabilities. I was trying to assist him during that time. The judge leaned forward, her voice a low, firm challenge. Sir, listen to me. There are a lot of places where someone who has a learning disability or who has some disability can work, even if it's for minimum wage. You're not doing him a favor. He was doing you a favor. He was working in your store. You weren't paying him. That's not fair. That's not reasonable. She held up a hand. Put your hand down. Her voice softened as she addressed Guy, the compassion in it a quiet, powerful force. Guy, you have to understand that some of the money that your brother got from Social Security was spent on you. You know, whether it was on your food. I mean, you certainly were fed, right? You may not have liked it, but you were fed. You had a roof over your head, right? So some of the money was spent on you, but you took advantage of him. You can't have him work in your store without paying him. Ralph, sensing a moment of weakness, tried to interrupt. He was paid, the judge. Oh, just a second, the judge said, cutting him off. The man in the gallery, Dennis, tried to speak, but the judge silenced him with a look. I think that you ought to be quiet. You know, we don't need anybody stirring up the pot. You're a pot stirrer. She looked at Ralph. You're supposed to give him a set amount of money. He's an employee if he comes into the store. Now, if you said to me you weren't getting any money from him, from Social Security, and he was working in your store to sort of pay for his keep in your home, that's a different story. But you were getting anywhere from $700 and change a month to $800 a month for him. And in addition to that, you give him a couple of bucks whenever you felt like it. She looked at Bonnie, who was shaking her head in furious denial. What do you mean? What are you shaking your head? No, madam. Can I tell you that's not? I have checks here where I would write to Guy and Guy. Bonnie reached for a stack of papers, pulling them from a worn folder. Guy didn't get $10 a day, okay, Judge Judy? He got money. We gave him. Even if we didn't make anything in the store, we paid Guy. Listen, that's what happens when you have a business, okay? The judge said, her voice now filled with a sharp, incredulous tone. Somebody works. But he got paid, okay? Bonnie insisted. Show me, show me. Show me the checks made out to him. The judge's voice was firm. Bonnie pushed the papers forward. These were checks made out to him, and I wrote them to him. He went to the bank, and he brought them back. The judge took the checks, her eyes scanning them. They were small, the amounts varying, made out to Guy. Show him. Ralph, in a last-ditch effort to prove his point, finally spoke clearly. I paid him, and I took money out of there, and I paid Guy. Just a minute, the judge said, her voice a warning. What do you mean? I wrote him a check, Ralph said, the words tumbling out of him. He cashed a check for me, okay? He looked at Guy, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Okay? The judge was listening, a grim, determined look on her face. Say the check was $80. I would give Guy $40. Ralph was trying to make it sound fair, but he was admitting to the very thing the judge was trying to prove. Bonnie jumped in. And no, this is just money. This had nothing to do with what Ralph was paying him. The judge leaned back in her chair. The courtroom was silent. The only sound was the high, relentless buzz of the fluorescent lights. The checks, which had been placed on the judge's bench as proof of payment, now looked heavy, more like evidence of a crime than a simple transaction. The private calculations on each face were now laid bare. On Ralph's and Bonnie's, there was a desperate, horrified realization of what they had just admitted. On Ms. Willie's, there was a quiet, agonizing ache, the grief of watching a loved one unravel. On Guy's, there was a quaint, sad calm. He had been right. So what you are telling me is you would write checks to him, the judge said, her voice slow and deliberate, for him to put in his account? No, Ralph's wife objected. The judge ignored her. She was speaking directly to Ralph. He would come back. He would come back and give you the cash. That's what you just said to me. And you would give him some of the cash. Ralph's shoulders slumped. Right. You know what that's called? The judge's voice was a whisper, but it filled the room. That's called money laundering. The words hung in the air, a final definitive condemnation. That's called money laundering in business. It may have only been $25, $30, $50, $80, but that's what it's called. You're giving him money to put in his account, right? And when he cashes the check, you were told to cash the check and bring back the cash, correct? Ralph's last shred of confidence evaporated. Yes. The judge's gaze shifted to Guy. And when you cashed the check that you, from your account, because this was made out to you, you gave your sister-in-law the money and she said, here's $10 for you, here's $20 for you. Is that what happened? Guy looked from Ralph to Bonnie and back at the judge. He was quiet, but his answer was clear. That's what she did. Is that what happened? The judge's gaze was fixed on Ralph and Bonnie, a final demand for a truth that they had finally, through their own words, revealed. The air in the courtroom seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension, the culmination of years of quiet neglect and selfish action. The silence stretched, and then the judge's voice, now loud and clear, broke it. I heard enough. She looked down at her papers for a moment and then looked up, her gaze settling on Guy. Judgment in this case is for the plaintiff in the amount of $2,531. The gavel came down with a sharp, final report, a sound that felt less like an ending and more like an echo, a resonance that lingered in the still, heavy air. It was a victory, but it was not a happy one. Ms. Willie felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a pang of grief. They had won, but they had lost so much more. The fragile threads of family had been cut, not by a single act, but by 1,000 small, cumulative betrayals. The sum of money awarded was significant, but it could never replace the years of trust that had been broken, the quiet dignity that had been stolen. They had come to court for justice, but what they had found was a final, irrefutable proof that this was always about trust, not only money. That's all, the judge said, her voice now flat and final. Parties are excused, the bailiff said, his voice a low rumble. You may step out.